Now, the third definition or dimension of culture laid out in chapter 1 is culture as a resource, or the globalization definition. And a lot of you already pointed out how this is a helpful sort of definition. It really takes into account the ways that culture is tied to economy, right? And the ways that culture might even be economy, right? Think about, for example, how, even tourism is the world's biggest economy, right? And how that economy of tourism is fueled by culture, right? The culture of Las Vegas is different than the culture of Thailand, which is different than the culture of Russia, right? And how, literally going to see the pyramids of Egypt, right? And the cultural dimensions of that are what draws people to go to travel to Egypt, right? Or to do the pilgrimage across Spain. It's like a Catholic tradition, I believe, where you start at one end of Spain and you walk and you finish at the ocean. It's like several hundred miles. And how that is a kind of, you go there to do that. You pay money to go do that and have that experience because culture is in fact a kind of resource. Right? There's literally money and economy tied to different cultures. Right? You can also think of it as a resource for a political movement, right? So, things like Black Lives Matter and signage and creating symbols and creating commercials and ads, right? Can also be are also a kind of resource, right? So even think about political parties, right now as the presidential elections going on, right? The between Trump and Biden, right? And this race to give either candidate money, right? And so that they can plug that into their campaign to make more cultural artifacts, commercials, media, propaganda, right? To get you to vote a certain way. So culture is definitely tied to resources, and in some ways, it already is a resource, right? You could argue, right, that there's wealth associated with access to culture, with the disseminating culture, right? Think of like even Facebook, right? How Facebook operates as a kind of cultural resource. How it, it's images, it's advertising, it's intercommunication, communication between people, right? And so it's a big resource in our society, right? So also resource for educating people, literacy and health campaigns. So the ways that you could educate people through some sort of campaign, right? What's it like, not to smoke, right? Or to wear a mask, right? They're also using the power of culture to get those messages out there, right? Through literacy, through health campaigns. I was just in Mexico City a year ago. I was in Mexico City, and there was like lots of posters and images reminding men not to grope women, and that women were the victims of groping in the subway. And it was just like this kind of like images to re-educate men and to remind them, that this isn't a space where it's totally unacceptable to touch women, right, without their consent, right, and in public, right. And so yes, using culture to actually educate and to do that is also a way that it's a resource. Resource for collective resistance and social change. Yes, bringing about resistance, social change, right? Use of different symbols, the rainbow flag for the LGBTQ community. Just the use of different symbols, right? That can become a kind of can bring about kind of social change. Even even the way that Kaepernick is kneeling, right, could be considered, right, because he has, or an athlete like LeBron, for example. LeBron is immersed in culture as a resource, right? He's such a big name and a brand, right? And then when he chooses to kneel, right, it's a highly symbolic act, right? And it's also, he's using his resources as LeBron, quote unquote, the brand of LeBron, to support, Black Lives Matter, right? Or to get people to vote, the vote campaign, right? That the NBA is doing. They're using the resources that the NBA has, right? Particularly like the symbolic power of the NBA. Well, the NBA is also a transnational corporation, right? It's in all these different parts of the world. And yeah, they're using their resources and their cultural clout to bring about change. Okay. So those are the three dimensions of culture. So you have, what is culture? It's not really clear cut. Traditionally, it's fallen on these lines of power and, what the powerful say is culture, right? But that's shifted. Culture has a side of shared meaning. Is the anthropological definition, very helpful. It's where we sort of go when we think about like, what is your culture? What is your group? Right? This is often where we go. What language do I speak? Right? Symbols, right, are always contingent, right? Their meanings are always culturally established, culturally dependent. Even, we consider what's attractive and what's not. The cultural studies definition, right, gets into how these symbols and their definitions and what they mean is contested, right? It's not a clear-cut black and white situation of what symbols mean, and that there's a lot at stake in who gets to say what means. And traditionally, right, some people have been oppressed by certain definitions, right, and taking that into account. And then, yeah, culture is a contested term, right? Hegemony, this idea of domination, or the idea that the powerful group of people, the privileged group of people, sort of determine the norms and the rules, and even shape our worldviews, and what is appropriate action, what is appropriate belief, and that definitely has an impact on it. I think there definitely is cultural hegemony, and taking that into account is also part of the cultural studies approach. And then culture as a resource, the ways that culture itself has economic effects, and how culture can be leveraged to as a site of resistance and change through symbolic action, through campaigns, right? And so finally we get here. So cultural identity, positionality, and standpoint theory. Yes. So these are pretty big terms, particularly for the cultural studies approach, I would say. And cultural identity is really big this semester for us and what we're interested in talking about. And it's really a kind of like situated sense of self that is shaped by our cultural experience and social locations. Yes, particularly like, what is my group? What is my sense of self? And how has that been established by, my cultural experience and my social locations, right? There's a old saying or a little story about a fish who, actually, I'm not going to tell you the fish story. Anyway, psych. Okay, second definition here, positionality, a term that describes how we're socially positioned in relation to each other. Yeah, definitely. So taking into account how, our relationship to one another, right? So in terms of our differences, in terms of race, class, gender, right? Who's historically been privileged, right? Who's historically been oppressed, and how might that play into our social interactions, right? How do I stand in relationship to someone who lives in a different country, right? Or how am I positioned in a relationship to someone of another gender, right? And taking that into account is a big part of intercultural communication and having awareness of that. Standpoint is huge and will be huge for us this semester. And a standpoint is a place from which to view and make sense of the world. Yes, so usually in the second week of class, I would have the class all stand up and look at an object. I would take like a black marker pen, and then have everyone stand up, and I would say, okay, who has the best view of this pen, you know? And people would be like, oh, Lisa has the best view of the pen because she's in the front row and she can see it and no one's in her way, right? And then I'd be like, who has the worst view of the pen? And they'd be like, me, because I'm in the back and I can't see and everyone's in front of me. My view of the pen is totally obscured. Yeah, and then I would say, okay, everyone stop and make eye contact with someone and switch places with them, right? And then we switch places and we say, okay, now who has the best view of the pen, you know? And someone's like, you know, we go around and people say, I have the best view, or my view changed, right? Now I see a different side of the pen that I couldn't before, right? And then, you know, maybe we move one more time, or say move to get a better view of this object, which is this black marker, you know. And then people move, and then we say, okay, well, what does standpoint theory teach us about this, what's embodied in this exercise, right? And what standpoint theory really tells us is that the way we view and make sense of the world is really hinged on our social locations, right? And that no one really has a perfect view of that pen, right? No one can necessarily see all sides of the pen at all times, right? So we all have these kind of partial, imperfect positions from which we view and make sense of the world, but that they're also valid, right? And it also argues that people who have been historically oppressed have more clear access to the truth of a particular object, particularly like oppression, right? So part of a defining feature of privilege, like say for example white privilege, is its oblivion, right? So the ways that there's knowledge being a white person or a heterosexual person, right, for example, or a wealthy person, there's knowledge and things that you don't have to know because of your position in the world, right? You know, so say for example, when I'm pulled over by the police, right, and I pass as a white cisgendered male, right, and so when the police pull me over and I roll down my window and I say, what do you want, right, and I can show anger, right, that's huge amount of privilege, right? It's just dripping with privilege that I'm allowed to do that, right? And so my knowledge of that situation and aspects of the situation, because of my body, I'm safe, right? And so there's things that I'm protected from that I don't have to know, right? I mean, I'm obviously trying to speak through them, but that's what standpoint. It's really standpoint epistemology, standpoint knowledge, right? And what it's teaching us. It's a fancy word, epistemology, but yeah. So how does our social locations really allow us? What does it allow us to see and not see, right? And that is a huge part of standpoint. It's actually called standpoint theory. Again, and yeah, positionality is also a big aspect of our semester. So how we stand in relationships to others, and then cultural identity, right? Like what is my group and how has it impacted my experiences? Discussion questions just to think about, right? How do you define yourself in terms of your cultural identity? And this is like really kind of goes along with the discussion post, I think, and introductory video. Yeah, so like, right away, right, kind of the work of this class is to think about what is my group, right? What is my cultural identity? And it can be very hard for us to be aware of this, right? I guess I will tell the fish story. So I think it's like these two fish are swimming, upstream, and an older fish is swimming downstream, right? And the older fish goes, "Hey boys, the water feels great today, doesn't it? And the two fish are like swimming along. Yeah. And then they pass by the older fish, and the two younger fish look at each other, and one of them says, "Hey, wait a minute. What's water?" So it can be very hard for us to be aware of the cultures that we belong to, right? And so part of the work of this class could be, if it's not clear for you, is what cultures do I belong to, right? What does it mean to be a white North American heterosexual male or working class male, right? Like, so you kind of get to do that work. Like, what are the groups that I belong to, right? And how do I define myself? And how come I've never had to define myself for? How come I always have to define myself, right? So starting to think about that. How does your cultural identity shape your perspectives, beliefs, and relationships with others? Yes, definitely. So, right, how has it shaped my, my experience of the police, right? Comes from my privileged position, right? For example, how does that impact how I see others and myself, right? Is the way you identify culturally related issues of power? Yeah, absolutely, right? So, growing up, I was like biracial and, but in the context that I grew up in a white area, so I didn't really want to identify like that because sort of the power and the norm in that community it was a white community, right? So you don't want to be biracial and brown in a community where that isn't valued, right? And so the powerful norms of that community, made me just want to quote unquote be white, right? And think about how all the ways that power is kind of at work, right, in our various identities and how that's impacted us. So these questions don't go away, right? They'll be with us all semester. Probing questions that you can definitely also put in your cultural identity paper, which I'll also talk about soon. There's also this notion of ethnocentrism, which is the idea that one group's way of thinking and acting is superior to others. Yeah, there's kind of like this default. I think it's actually kind of natural in a sense that we often have it, and it's very hard. Like this default, right? Like, so my culture is the best. My culture, but it's even more subtle than that. It's kind of like my culture is normal. My culture is, my culture is normal. So, like, for example, like, oh, you don't celebrate Christmas. That's so weird. Or, oh, you don't eat ham on Easter. That's so bizarre. Right? Like, that's kind of ethnocentric, right? That assumption that even your way of doing things is the only way, or that it's normal, and that all other ways are weird, right? And so I think that's part of it too. Is ethnocentrism asks us to see things that are different from us, not as quote unquote weird, but just simply different, right? Simply different. This is a good example of colonization, by the way, how Africa, the African continent, was chopped up by the various colonial powers, right? And good example of how ethnocentrism, right, led to this kind of primed quote unquote first world powers, quote unquote, to kind of like go into other countries and take over and divvy it up, right? Also thinking about culture as a resources here too, right? Because they were thinking about all the resources that were tied to these different communities and countries in Africa, right? So yeah, we want to guard against ethnocentrism. Again, easier said than done. But even it's kind of like, oh, that's weird, or why do you do it that way? I think why you do it that way is actually could be a good question, but just being open-minded to other ways of doing things. I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'll continue in the next video.